Hi guys, it's Claire, welcome back. So a couple of months ago when I made my 1 year on BookTube video, I put out a call for questions in case any of you had any of them. So I thought I would finally answer them today. So if you want to know a little bit more about me and my reading life, feel free to stick around. If you're not that interested, see you later. But let's just get into it. I thought I would start with this question from Gloomy Lamp, which is, was there any book that specifically got you into reading, or have you always been a reader? So I've always been a reader, but when I was younger, my older brother was like a true legit bookworm and read all the time. So in comparison to him, I kind of didn't feel like that much of a reader, so it wasn't part of how I conceptualized myself or whatever. But I always was definitely reading, and when I was really little, my parents got me some picture book versions of the Little House books, and then later the actual Little House books, and I strongly identified with those because Laura Ingalls Wilder grew up, at least in the first book, in the big woods of Wisconsin, and I similarly grew up near some trees in Wisconsin. The Orange Book asks, what did you study while at university? So I studied history, and although I wasn't required to pick a particular focus or concentration, I studied mostly cultural and social history, and a lot of the classes that I took centered on 19th and 20th century American history, but my major also left a lot of room for electives. So in addition to my history classes, I took a ton of history and literature classes, women and gender studies classes, sociology classes, English classes, and a couple of film classes too. So it was a true liberal arts education. Alex from What Page Are You On asks, I believe you studied history in school. If so, is there a specific class you took that you felt everyone should take or be exposed to? So this class didn't actually fall within the history department, and I apologize in advance because I'm coming at this from a very American perspective, but I took an Intro to African American Studies class my sophomore year, and that was probably the most important class I took in college in terms of making me a more informed person and a better global citizen, because at least in my experience, when Black history is taught in middle school and high school in America, it's very much divided into slavery and the Civil War, and then civil rights and Martin Luther King Jr. And in my experience, Reconstruction wasn't taught particularly well, and the structural inequalities of the 20th century, be it sharecropping or housing inequality or the war on drugs and mass incarceration, just wasn't taught at all. So taking an Intro to African American Studies class was really eye-opening for me, and I think that every American should be required to take a class like that, although in an ideal world we would also have to learn more about Asian American history, Latino American history, women's history, etc., etc. But that would be a good place to start. Eric Carl Anderson asks, is there an author or book topic that you're so passionate about you'd like to do a post-grad dissertation or write your own nonfiction book focusing on that author or topic? That is a really interesting question. I have no desire to write a dissertation of any kind, and I don't think I've read enough or lived long enough to write a full book about any other topic. But I will say, although I don't really miss college at all, I do sometimes come across a book that I love, like Middlemarch or the Neapolitan novels or Eileen Chang's work, where I do sometimes wish that I could go back and talk about those books in a discussion section or write like a paper about it, do some good close reading or whatever. Jasmine's Reads asks, what is your favorite ever classic? That would be Villette by Charlotte Bronte. I made a full video talking about Villette last fall, so I'm going to link it up here and down below if you want to go check that out. Alexia Marple asks, which books have helped you either to grow up or understand things or through difficult times? So when I think about a book that has been a real balm to me, both while reading it and many years after the fact, I do think of books like Villette, which I think I read at the exact right time. I read that book when I was 22, and when the themes of unrequited love and making your own way in the world really struck a chord with me. Another book like that is The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion, which I wouldn't call an instructive book about grief, but there are some reflections and insights about grief in that book that I have thought about many times when kind of trying to wrap my head around something that is otherwise so kind of ludicrous and unfathomable. The Actual Spinster asks, what would you say is the book you would pick to introduce yourself as a person to someone you just met? I don't know. That's a really interesting question. I don't actually think I have one because I think reading is such a kind of personal and subjective experience that my reading of a book and what it means to me is not something that could ever be replicated by someone else when they're reading a book. They're kind of going to have their own individual experience. And I also don't think I really form my sense of identity around the specific particular things that I like in any given moment or period of life. That's why I would like never get a tattoo. I think when I was younger, I was much more likely to be like, I like this band or this movie, and that's what this says about me. Whereas now I would say that the fact that I like reading probably says more about me than any one particular book, which is an unsatisfying answer. But I do think this is an interesting question. So if any of you out there have a book that you would give to someone to introduce yourself, let me know down below. Katie from Books and Things asks, what is the best book you've read since joining BookTube and or because of BookTube? That would probably have to be Half a Lifelong Romance, which I first saw on Matthew Sharappa's channel and absolutely loved. It's one of my favorite books of the year so far, and it's definitely something that I don't think I would have come across if I hadn't been watching BookTube. Allison Rose says, what are some backlist recommendations you have, specifically books you've never talked about on your channel? So I really had to think about this because I actually have mentioned a lot of my favorite backlist titles in a number of different videos on this channel, but I thought I would mention My Antonia by Willa Cather, which is a 1918 novel about pioneers and Czech immigrants on the Nebraska frontier, and it is a bit dated at certain points, but I just find her descriptions of the Nebraska landscape and frontier to be so incredibly moving, and I don't know if that's because I'm from the Midwest or what, but I really love that book. I also really love The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton. I read The Age of Innocence in college and really liked it, and then I read The House of Mirth on my own and I loved it. It's much darker and in some ways much bolder than The Age of Innocence, and I just think Edith Wharton writes so well about New York's upper crust in a way that kind of pokes fun at those people and criticizes them while also allowing you to retain some sympathy for them, especially for characters like Lily Bart. So I definitely recommend that one. Jeffrey Huang asked, how do you analyze the books you read? For example, if you annotate your books, how do you do it? What factors do you consider when judging a book's quality, and how do you prioritize them? What are you generally looking to get out of a book, etc.? I absolutely annotate my books, usually by underlining and bracketing things. Sometimes I write something down in the margins, or if I'm struck by a particularly insightful idea, I'll jot it down on a notes app on my phone. In terms of what factors do you consider when judging a book's quality, how do you prioritize them? That's a great question and something I've been thinking a lot about since joining BookTube. So when talking about a book, I try to think first and foremost about what a writer is trying to accomplish and whether they've been successful at that. I also think it's interesting and often important to think about how a book exists and functions in the world, whether it's a contemporary book that is commenting on our current world either through the themes and subject matter or through its literary style. If it's an older book, I think it's important to consider its relevance now, but I also think it's important to look back at the historical context and moment in which it was written. And beyond those things, I try to consider whether a book is intellectually or emotionally stimulating. And when doing this in particular, I think you have to be really careful about considering your own particular taste and preferences. As of right now, I think that I tend to prioritize emotional resonance, character development, mood, and kind of what a book has to say about the human condition or whatever over, say, a high concept premise or a clever structure or kind of challenging experimental writing. I can definitely appreciate those things if they're done well, but they're not the most important thing to me when I read. And I think that it's just important to kind of acknowledge that and find a balance between your own personal taste and what a book is trying to do. Adam from Memento Mori asks, favorite films? So I don't know that I have particularly sophisticated taste in movies, but I do really like film and cinema, and I would say that the movies that most appeal to me are the ones that have a strong emphasis on things like mood and atmosphere and cinematography. I really like visually striking films. So I mentioned this briefly in a previous video, but my favorite movie of all time is probably In the Mood for Love by Wong Kar-wai. I would also recommend Wong Kar-wai in general. I love Happy Together and 2046 and Chungking Express. They're all excellent, and they also all star Tony Leung, who is an incredible Hong Kong actor. If you liked the movie Moonlight by Barry Jenkins, which I really loved, he is someone who has cited Wong Kar-wai as a major influence, and if you watch Moonlight and In the Mood for Love, even though the content of the stories are quite different, there are definite stylistic similarities. Also, kind of unexpectedly, I really like movies like Drive and Blade Runner just because they have such great mood and atmosphere. A couple examples of kind of more recent movies that I really loved are things like Arrival and Jackie, which is an incredible movie that not enough people talk about, and I say that as someone who has read like way too much about the Kennedys. That movie is great. So yeah, and then you kind of have old favorites like Back to the Future, 13 Going on 30, you know, those kind of modern classics. Joe Smith asks, what country or countries would you most like to visit and why? So I'm actually really excited because I am going to Korea and Japan next spring. I'm going with my older brother and his girlfriend and another friend, and we just booked our tickets, so I am super psyched about that. I've never been to Asia before, and I've always been kind of intimidated by it because of like the language barrier and other things, but my brother's girlfriend is from Seoul and everyone I'm traveling with has already been to Japan, so it should be pretty easy for me, but I'm really looking forward to it. And if you've been to either of those countries and have recommendations, definitely let me know. I would love to hear some of them. I would also really like to go hiking in Patagonia in Argentina and Chile at some point. That is definitely on the bucket list as well. But anyway, thanks to everyone who asked a question. Hopefully you found this interesting. If you have any other questions or comments on some of the things discussed here, definitely let me know. Otherwise, thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you next time. Bye!